This week on the show, we have FreeBSD 11.3 being released, OpenBSD workstation setup, write your own fuzzer for the NetBSD kernel, exploiting the FreeBSD security advisory 1902.fd, streaming to Twitch using OpenBSD is an interesting one, and we also cover 3 different ways of dumping hex contents of a file and more in this week's episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 307, Twitching with OpenBSD, recorded on the 17th of July, 2019. Hello, I'm your host, Benedikt Kreuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we welcome you back to this week's episode of BSD Now, bringing you the freshest BSD news that we could find. And the headline starts with FreeBSD 11.3 has been released. The announcement is there, so it's official.
Yes, so the latest release in the 11 branches available, bring with it newer versions of the toolchain like Clang, LLVM, LLD, LLDB, and compiler RT, and libc++, etc. The ELF toolchain bits have also been updated to a newer version, the latest OpenSSL, improvements to ZFS, including parallel mounting. So that is, if you have many data sets, like hundreds or thousands, like some of my machines do, mount more than one at a time. So during startup, when you see it counting through the data sets it's mounting, that should go much faster now.
Ah, good.
That's not to be confused with the multi-mount protection feature, which is coming, which is designed for a system where you have disks in an external shelf that might actually be connected to 2 different computers, and making sure you don't import the pool on 2 different machines at the same time, which could damage the pool. That's a different thing that's coming, but it's not this. There was a feedback email where someone was confused about the difference between parallel mounting and multi-mount protection.
Okay, so we cleared that up.
The other big change that comes is the work I did a couple of years ago to make Geli able to have support in our bootloader so that you can boot from a fully encrypted disk has been extended to work on all platforms instead of only x86. So thanks to Ian and Kyle and Warner and everybody else who helped with that, means that you can now use this on ARM and other platforms as well.
Excellent.
I think Ian actually needed it on MIPS or ARM, one of the two, for an appliance type thingy. And he managed to generalize the code so it works on all platforms.
Mm-hmm.
The built-in version of package has been updated, also provides newer KDE, GNOME, etc. And the kernel will now log the jail ID when logging a process exit. So if a program crashes, it would normally tell you a little bit about it in the log, but it will also tell you which jail it was in, which might be quite helpful in figuring out what... It's like, oh, Nginx crashed. I'm like, which Nginx?
In which jail?
Is that on the host or in the jail? Several feature additions and updates to userland applications, network drivers and firmware updates, etc. Also, they've extended the Gone in 13 flag. So if you're using features in FreeBSD 11.3 that will be removed in FreeBSD 13, you will now receive a warning each time you use it for the first time. This giving you more heads up that that's going away. Since some people will possibly skip from 11.4 to 13 or something like that, skipping over all of 12, it didn't make sense to limit those deprecation warning messages only to version 12.
Yeah, because they apply also now to this release at least.
Yeah. Also, additional warnings have been added for some of the IPsec algorithms that will be deprecated as part of RFC 8221. So if you're using really, really bad old crypto in IPsec, you'll get a warning now. And recommendation that you update to some of the newer ones. The main advantage to that is most of those support hardware offload, and you will get much, much better performance. And similar deprecation warnings have been added if you're using any of the weaker providers for Geli. Probably want to be using the AES XTS for Geli, but if you're using one of the older, less good ones, you will get a warning now.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, so we'll be always safe and secure.
Mm-hmm. Reminder that under the relatively new policies of the FreeBSD project, the release of FreeBSD 11.3 means that FreeBSD 11.2 will go end of life in 3 months.
Yeah, so update if you haven't done so yet.
It's quite a minor update. It's, barely more than just applying the security fixes. So it's a nice, easy update. So we recommend that you do that sooner rather than later.
So enjoy the new release if you are still on 11, and report anything that you find, or something that you found, or something that works better now, for example, that we're always looking forward to from users using these releases or the project as a whole. Next up, we have OpenBSD is now my workstation as an article. And this is basically starting off with a nice screenshot of Puffy bootloader, or no, it's not a bootloader, it's the NeoFetch. It starts with, why OpenBSD? You may ask, of course. Simply because it's the best tool for the job for me and for my new, to me, Lenovo ThinkPad T420. Additionally, I do care about security and non-bloat in my personal operating systems. Business needs can have different priorities, to be clear. So they will detail what their reasons are for going with OpenBSD and not GNU Linux, NetBSD, or FreeBSD, which they are more comfortable with using without issues. Some of the challenges and frustrations they've encountered, and also the opinions they found along the way. So they talk a bit about the history of OpenBSD they had. They're not new to OpenBSD, or the guy who wrote this. He's been using it off and on for over 20 years. The biggest time in his life was the earliest 2000s, so that's quite a while already. He was even a Python port maintainer for a bit. Where he was not only using it for the workstation, but also for production servers and network devices. So there's definitely a wider range of use. And so he mentions that OpenBSD's documentation is great, so that's one reason. And that the installation of OpenBSD is a breeze. And there's the first thing that he mentions as a feature is the full disk encryption. I wish full disk encryption of /home encryption, or the /home, was baked into the installer so that it's available right away. The ability to retroactively apply full disk encryption would also be great, like VeraCrypt on Windows.
That is extremely difficult to do properly.
Yeah, like after the fact, difficult. But for now, he simply puts a password on boot via the BIOS, which may be good enough, but the hard drive can be removed. There are always small attack vectors here and there, but it's at least better than unencrypted. So there's a guide to the soft-rate FDE full disk encryption that he links from the post. And he's going to have to reinstall to get full, transparent full disk encryption, and is not sure about how much of a performance hit that would be, which is less than ideal, but would make it where he adds all the non-stock customizations to an Ansible playbook. There are also two updates regarding AES-NI on CPUs that are supporting it. So the performance impact is minimal. And the second update talks about the full disk encryption, which seems to be working fine without issue. Okay, the next thing that's listed is the wireless networking. So he wishes the extra firmware would be installed from the installer already, so he can leverage the Intel Wi-Fi right away from the installer. They thought they picked that Wi-Fi stuff once. Maybe I configured the wired internet first, maybe. They write. But when I did a question mark to see a Wi-Fi access point in the installer, he got nothing back and had to use the wired Ethernet, which is not a big deal. But if you're not in the vicinity of a cable, then it's difficult. But it's fairly easy to join the wireless network, and there's a few lines to describe how that is done. And then running DHCP, of course.
Yep, and it also talks about doing system updates and using binary packages, power management, using do-as instead of sudo, hyperthreading, using the Xenokera desktop manager, and so on, using XFCE, which is this the author prefers, using Thunderbird with GPG, which is what I do. It works very nicely. Talks about some of the applications he had trouble with, and in particular moving from Evernote, which doesn't have a FreeBSD or OpenBSD client available, other than the web app. And his having been using it for 10 years and using it daily, it was a big shift. And so talks a bit about that. And then also has trouble with virtualization. VirtualBox is not available on OpenBSD, and the Linux emulation was removed a while ago. So running virtual machines like I'm used to, using VirtualBox a lot at work and so on, is problematic. VMD is cool tech, but it isn't quite useful for the type of red team InfoSec stuff that he's trying to do. So he used libvirt, basically running KVM QEMU virtual machines on a separate machine and controlling them from OpenBSD with libvirt. So yeah, he basically says his biggest pain points were Evernote and VirtualBox. And thanks to Blackheim on Twitter, who is originally the producer for BSD Now, and also Misha Peters, who helped him get the Wi-Fi configuration correct.
Yeah, so you see that OpenBSD can be a very decent workstation.
Mm-hmm.
So, time for the news roundup this week. We found an article from the NetBSD blog about writing your own fuzzer for NetBSD kernel, part 1. Nice thing about that is that they go into detail about how to do that. So first, they start with how fuzzing works, the dummy fuzzer. There's a little graphic here with a blindfolded rabbit throwing a knife at a Wheel of Fortune, basically, with hex codes on it, or hex addresses.
It's got some hex addresses. It's got no memory, ebad, fd, sigsegv, erange, etc. So yeah, random hex and error codes.
Yeah. And so that's why they write the easy way to describe fuzzing is to compare it to the process of unit testing a program, but with different input. This input can be random, like in the rabbit example, or it can be generated in some way that makes it unexpected from standard execution perspective. And the simplest fuzzer can be written in a few lines of bash by getting n bytes from defrand, or the random device, and putting them to the program as a parameter. Okay, so that's very simple, but yet effective.
Right, but if you're going to try every possible input, then it can get very time-consuming because you're just giving random input of random lengths, and you might have to do a lot of different tests before you find something. Right. If it turns out the bug only happens when you provide more than a kilobyte of input, and you just start with, let's try 1 byte of every possible value, and then 2 bytes, it could take a long time.
Or you need a specific sequence, and when the program then crashes, you need to stop at that sequence and then continue with the next one.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as a basic thing, that's the idea. The coverage and fuzzing part is about what can be done to make fuzzing more effective. If we think about fuzzing as a process where we place data into the input of the program, which is the black box, and we can only interact via input, not much more can be done. However, programs usually process different inputs at different speeds, which can give us some insight into the program's behavior. During the fuzzing, we are trying to crash the program, so we need additional probes to observe the program's behavior. And they talk a bit about AFL, the American Fuzzy Lob. That's why the rabbit is there as a picture. And that's one of the first successful fuzzers. It uses a technique where the program is compiled with injected traces for every execution branch instruction. And during the program execution, every branch is counted, and the analyzer then builds a graph out of the execution paths and explores the different interesting paths. So you cannot do that on every program. It needs the AFL traces in there.
Right, but part of the idea is to look at it and be like, okay, when the program works, we always go through the if case, never the else case. So what do we have to change the input to force this to give us the else case? And then we can check that bit of the code. And the idea is to make sure that, with the idea of coverage and coverage testing is to make sure that every different path in the code is actually tested so that you don't end up with, if you do this one strange thing, you end up in this code that it turns out no one has ever run before.
Yeah, and that's where the bugs lure, usually. And then there's talk about KCOV modules, because they ultimately want to port the AFL as a module to use that to fuzz the kernel. And they describe how to do that by creating a KCOV module and then porting the AFL as the module. And then, of course, since every fuzzer is also a program, how do you debug your fuzzer? That's, I guess, a stage before fuzzing the fuzzer. So debug your fuzzer. Everyone knows that kernel debugging is more complicated than programs running in the user space. Many tools can be used for doing that, and there's always a discussion about usability versus complexity of the setup. People tend to be divided into two groups. Prefer to use a complicated setup like kernel debugger with remote debugging, and those who like tools like printf and other simple debug interfaces, and they think those are sufficient enough. Enabling the coverage brings even more complexity to kernel debugging. Everyone's favorite printf also becomes traced, so putting it inside the trace function will result in a stack overflow. Oops. Also, touching any KCOV internal structures becomes very tricky and should be avoided if possible. And yeah, then they talk about an example debug con printf that they developed to counteract that, and then talk about future work, which I guess we will also cover. So it's good to read this article as an introduction, and I I'm fairly sure that we will cover future articles from this blog post series in the future. So this is just part 1.
So next up, we have a reminder about VBSDCon 2019, which will take place at the Hyatt Regency in Reston, Virginia, September 5th to 7th. And the call for papers is still open for a few more days, so hurry up and submit.
Yeah, through EasyChair, it's easy, create an account.
VBSDCon is extra like sysadmin focused, so we'd really like to get a lot more, sysadmin-y talks, but we need developer talks and user talks and all the talks.
Yeah, as long as they're BSD specific.
Yes, please submit your BSD talk.
Because that makes the conference worthwhile going to. And also, we also, as developers, want to hear how you use BSD in your environment, in your context, in your whatever you have as a job for the operating system. And that makes it interesting. And then maybe, talk about this not just at the conference, but also in the hallway track. So this is a 3-day conference, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, September 5th to the 7th. And check out the website. And don't forget, as Alan said, to submit something if you have an interesting talk.
Yes, please submit. The program committee would really like more submissions. So please submit.
They're getting bored with too few of them. Yeah, it's never good to have only that many conference submissions if you want to really fill your program with good talks.
There'll be some other stuff going on too. We're going to make the conference fun and interesting, but we would like to have as wide a selection of talks to pick from as possible, and also more idea on what people are interested in hearing about as well.
Oh yeah, so that's a good opportunity to get also to know the people behind, because they're also developers going, of course, to Alan and I as well. And good opportunity to talk to people and discuss certain ideas or projects that you're working on in the BSD space. Okay, up next, we found that there is a way of exploiting the FreeBSD security announcement 19:02.fd.
Yeah, so this is a security advisory for FreeBSD that came back out back in February. And in the advisory, it was mentioned that, it could lead to somebody being able to get root, but there was no proof of concept that existed at the time. So the security researchers over here at SecVault Security managed to actually walk through that and show how it works. So if you're at all interested in how this stuff works or how you would build it, it's available here. So they start off, Unix-like systems such as FreeBSD allow you to send file descriptors to other processes via Unix domain sockets. This can be, for example, be used to pass file access privileges to a receiving process. This concept can also be important in things like Capsicum, where you have sandboxing. So you have a process that has some privilege, and it's going to spawn a child with less privilege, but it needs to be able to give it access to a file or something. So inside the kernel, a file descriptor, which is really just a number, an integer, is actually used as an indirect reference to a C-struct that stores all the relevant information about the file object. It could be a reference to the vnode on the file system, the file's type, is it a file or a directory or whatever, and what access permissions it has, and so on. What really happens if a Unix domain socket is used to send a file descriptor to another process is that the receiving process inside the kernel gets a reference to that struct. Because each application each process in the kernel has a separate file descriptor table. Most applications are using file descriptor 3, 4, and 5, and so on. It's not a global number from the kernel. Each process has its own. And so as the new file descriptor is a reference to the same object as the one from the sender, all information is inherited. For instance, this can allow the master process to give write access to a child process, even if that child process wouldn't even normally be able to open the file or not open it as being writable. The advisory describes that FreeBSD 12.0 introduced a bug in this mechanism. As the file descriptor information is sent via a socket, the sender and receiver have to allocate buffers for that procedure. If the receiving buffer is not large enough, the FreeBSD kernel attempts to close the received file descriptor to prevent a leak of the resource from the sender. However, while the responsible closes the file descriptor, it actually fails to release the reference to the struct, to the file object, which eventually it's basically a memory leak. And the count of how many references there are, you could just keep going up until you wrap that around back to 0. The advisory further states that the impact of this bug is possibly a local privilege escalation to gain root, or even maybe escape a jail. However, no proof of concept was provided by the advisory's authors. So this blog post catches up on that and describes their research into exploiting the bug in order to actually obtain root privileges. So in the next section, the bug itself is analyzed to make a statement about the bug class and what other exploitation primitives could be used against it. Then they look at triggering the bug, and then 3 imaginable exploit scenarios and strategies where you could actually make use of this, including discussion of 2 attempts they had that actually failed. And then lastly, the working exploit primitive is discussed and introduces a new exploitation technique for these kind of vulnerabilities in FreeBSD. And then lastly, wrap up with a conclusion and points out some further steps if you're interested in continuing the work. And they mentioned that all references in the code, like line numbers, are references to the vulnerable source tree from shipped to the original 12.0 release, and they have a link to where you can grab the tarball of that source code. So they start with the bug analysis. They say, to get a first hint about the origin of the bug, we look at the original patch that introduced the bug, R343790 of the FreeBSD 12 release engineering branch. And you can see that it changed from, if error is 0, then F drop the counter there. It changed from just closing the file descriptor to also dropping the reference. Only a single call in the function mdispose external control in the file uicp syscalls was added. The bug was therefore introduced because the function lacks a call to the macro fdrop, which drops a reference to the file struct. So the natural question is, what is the purpose of this macro? So then they go look at that.
I see, yeah.
And then they see where they use UMA zfree, which is UMA is a slab allocator thing in the FreeBSD kernel. So they say this is an internal kernel function which frees an allocated chunk of memory from the heap. It is beyond the scope of the document to discuss how UMA works and so on. But they have some links mentioned that, as always, the best reference for most of this stuff is the design and implementation of the FreeBSD operating system by McCusick, Neville Neal, and Watson. And then they look at the vulnerable path. They have lots of code examples, and they show making a little application to do this. And so then they look at the exploitation strategies. The first is using a setuid program. One of the simplest strategies is the following. Is it possible to trigger this use after free and executing some setuid program like the password command, resulting in a dangling file descriptor to a file owned by root, including all those capabilities? An exploit would need to place the struct file object exactly into the file zone bucket where needed. If the setuid program opens a file owned by root, master.password or libmap.conf, in a way that's writable, it could be possible to write to this file from the user-controlled context. They say, in theory, this strategy works. A proof of concept can be found in the setuid test client.c and test server.c. And they note that the server has to be root-owned and made setuid for this example to work. They say, however, finding such a program turned out to be trickier than expected. Most utilities in the standard installation open interesting files read-only or close them too fast. So then they look at memory corruption or exchanging the file object during the write, and so on. So they also look at escalating to root. As I described in the previous section, the strategy is basically a time of check, time of use attack on the write syscall. So write is called for a file which is writable by the user. The syscall will first check if the file referenced by the file descriptor is indeed writable by the user or results in an error otherwise. After the check is passed, the use after free vulnerability is triggered, and a root-owned read-only file is opened by the user right after that. Check works the following way. The write syscall results in a call to the kernel function syswrite, which subsequently calls kern writev in the same file, which then calls fgetWrite. The latter is defined in kern descript, obviously because it's file descriptors. This function is used to retrieve the struct file object for the file descriptor and check for the write capabilities. So to do this, the function calls underscore fget to get the file struct. Anyway, and then it also calls doFileWrite to actually do the work and so on. And so they walk through all that.
Yeah, it's quite long. Yep.
Yep, and they also have they talk a bit about using libmap in order to basically create a dynamic library which copies bin sh to some other file and makes it setuid. So that when you do manage to do this, basically, if you can write to the libmap file by using this exploit, then you can make it so that it uses a bad version of libutil instead of the stock version. And then next time somebody runs su or some setuid program, it will run your evil library, which will make a copy of the shell binary that setuid root. So then you just have to come back and run that and you'll have root access. Again, this vulnerability is patched. So they say, in conclusion, the past blog post showed the exploitation of a simple yet easy to overlook vulnerability in FreeBSD. While the use after free trigger was quite simple to develop, the research to find a way to exploit the vulnerability needed a lot more effort. The main reason for this seems to be the reasonably good engineering of the kernel code and the sparse landscape of write-ups on FreeBSD vulnerabilities. The author hopes that this blog post does contribute well to the latter and does help at least more of his neighbors during their own research. To the best of the knowledge of this author, this blog post is the first to describe a working exploit for this particular vulnerability. The exploitation technique itself should come handy in similar situations, which trigger a use after free in the file zone in the FreeBSD kernel allocator. Without major changes to the kernel code, this same technique should remain. Moreover, the elegance of logic exploits comes to shine when using this exploit without modification on other installations on even different CPU architectures like ARM.
Right.
They do say there are some further steps should be mentioned. At the moment, the exploit technique only works on UFS. While this was the standard file system in the past, nowadays ZFS is widely adopted for FreeBSD installations. However, the technique does not work with ZFS because the dirty buffer mechanism is different. Therefore, the msleep is never triggered, which renders the race unreliable. The chances are high that another delay mechanism could be found, but currently it only works against UFS. The code to render the race condition reliable via doing a lot of parallel writes to create dirty buffers seems inelegant. Therefore, maybe there is another way to create a write delay. That was the quickest, but at the time, that was the quickest way they found. And last but not least, there are maybe different ways to exploit the vulnerability. For example, one could think about tricking a setuid program to read from a file it does not intend to read from, such as tricking SU into reading from a user-provided version of PAM, of a PAM config file that maybe says, everybody can sue, it's fine.
No worries. What could possibly go, oh.
And then they have all the details of their testing setup if you want to recreate any of this, and they have their patches and so on.
All right. Next up, we have a little streaming how-to for you, for the people who are into twitching or into using Twitch. This is for streaming to Twitch using OpenBSD. And if you ever wanted to make a Twitch stream from your OpenBSD system, this is now possible, thanks to OpenBSD developer THFR, who made a wrapper named FoxStream using FFmpeg with relevant parameters. The setup is quite easy. It only requires a few steps in searching on Twitch websites to information that you need. Hopefully, it's easy enough you found the links already. So preparation steps is basically you register. Well, who would have thought that you need to register to connect to Twitch? Then you get your streaming API key, which is your unique username, basically. And then you choose your nearest server from this page. And there's a link to that. Add in your shell environment a little variable called Twitch to your server from step 3. This is the closest server to you with your API key. Then you get FoxStream from OpenBSD's... Oh, that's not OpenBSD's CVS.
Just the developer's CVS, yeah.
The authors. Then you make that executable, and then you allow the recording from microphone and recording of the output sound. Like we do, Alan and I.
By default, OpenBSD blocks those, and so you have to specifically allow them.
So that no one can listen into you in malicious ways. Now, using FoxStream. FoxStream scripts, or that script itself, comes with a README-MD file containing some useful information. You can also check the usage. It's just FoxStream from the command line. Starting a stream. When you start a stream, take care of your API key isn't displayed on the stream. Yeah. Here, you redirect standard error to def null, so all the output containing the key is not displayed. And it's basically a couple of parameters, and you basically define the screen resolution, I think the bit rate, the Twitch variable you need to reference, of course, to have the API key. And if you choose a smaller resolution in your screen, imagine a square of that resolution starting at the top left corner of your screen. The content of the square will then be streamed. And they also recommend a BWM-NG package, which is a port to view your real-time bandwidth usage, so you can see how much you're consuming. And then if you see that this bandwidth reaches a fixed number, this means you reached your limit, and the stream is certainly not working correctly. You should lower your resolutions a little bit so that people can still enjoy your stream.
Well, in particular, the -B4000 there is making a 4 megabit output.
Oh.
You'd want to lower that to some number that makes sense for your bandwidth. And it also covers how to overlay a webcam on top in one of the corners of your video or whatever. I just have one note for that one, that obviously this works with things other than Twitch as well. You can put in the RTMP URL for YouTube or Facebook or whatever, and you can stream to there as well.
Yeah.
Another option is there's an open source program called OBS, or Open Broadcaster Studio. There's a port on FreeBSD. I don't know if anyone's done one for OpenBSD, but the software should just work. It's pretty straightforward software, but it gives you an actual graphical application where you can composite multiple layers, like you can have a video file playing or capture your screen and then composite some text over it and put your webcam capture over it. And it gives you a nice GUI for doing all this, and also lets you easily do scene switching and so on. We use this heavily at Scale Engine for testing and so on, but also Jupiter Broadcasting, the podcast network, has switched to using it instead of Wirecast, which is the program they used to do that, which cost $1,000 per copy. And doing that with open source software is better, and it's free.
Yeah, see?
OBS even goes so far as to support green screening. So you can actually get quite a fancy setup going from your OpenBSD or FreeBSD box using that.
Oh, that's not too bad.
Oh, another thing we mentioned was that this script or whatever, or any of them, will also work with Scale Engine's live video streaming, which is available free to BSD user groups. So if you're going to use this to stream a BSD user group, and you'd rather not have it on YouTube with ads, you can just get in touch with Scale Engine and we'll set you up.
Very cool. So I guess we'll create a couple more streamers this way.
The graphical application is a bit easier, but you can do it with a command line like this. Or if you check out the slides from Tom Jones's talk at EuroBSDCon last year, it covers how to do this with HDMI capture stuff. So a slightly modified version of that would work very well for capturing like an Xbox or a PlayStation if you want to stream that via your OpenBSD or FreeBSD machine.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Or if you just want to, say, capture the laptop from the speaker at your BSD user group, which is more what Tom was actually talking about. But whether it's for gaming or presenting, this stuff all works quite nicely on all the BSDs.
So try it out and happy twitching. So it's time for the Beastie Bits this week. In our previous segment, we talked already about BSD user groups, and this one is already meeting in different places. It's the Portland BSD Pizza Night. This time, they're meeting on the 25th of July at 7 p.m. at Rudy's Gourmet Pizza. Oh, that's a name. That should definitely be a good quality pizza you get there.
If you're interested in meeting up with a bunch of BSD folks from a bunch of different BSDs and eating pizza, drinking, or just hanging out and talking about stuff, then you should come out.
Yeah. Then there's Knoxbuck, the Knoxville BSD user group. And they also have something special here.
A special guest?
Yep. Michael W. Lucas with 20 years in jail.
That'll be Monday, July 29th at 6 p.m.
Oh, yeah, still time to get there. It's based on his book, FreeBSD Mastery Jails, and he talks about what you can do with jails, how they got started, and properties, jail management, all the important things that are covered also in the book. And he writes, or the description is, you'll leave with an understanding of what modern jails can and cannot do, and hints for future development.
And the meeting will be at the IX Systems office, which is by the Foothills Mall on Keller Lane in Marysville, Tennessee.
Oh, excellent. Michael Lucas and the IX folks. That's a good connection in the BSD space here. All right. Then we move from the BSD user groups to Ohio Linux Fest. The call for paper closes August 17th. So if you want to give a talk, definitely submit for the Ohio Linux Fest.
Yes, Ohio Linux Fest has a long tradition having some BSD-focused talks, and we'd like to keep that up. So that requires people to give BSD-focused talks at Ohio Linux Fest.
Yeah, they have a range of topics, general sysadmin, DevOps, cloud computing, big data, machine learning. So wherever you might be using BSD or any other interesting part of the BSD ecosystem, then definitely submit to those. Chances are you are accepted and give the talk.
And then lastly, they were looking at as somebody who's at their university and they're in the process of moving their computer science department and then wrapped up on a shelf by internetworking with TCP/IP and Windows Internals 4, they found the design and implementation of the FreeBSD operating system.
I mean, these are the books you need to have on your bookshelf at least.
Yeah.
Keep them close.
Well, what they need to do is get the second edition, because that's the first edition.
That too. And put it next to the original one, so you have all the D&I books in logical, chronological order. And for bonus, you need to collect the signatures from the authors.
I think one of my 2 copies has all 3 signatures.
Yeah, it's difficult to get all of these, but it's not impossible. You can definitely get them when you hang around in the BSD space. And last but not least, we have found 3 different ways of dumping hex contents of a file. So this might be something you might not do every day, but it's still important to know what this is about. So at times when you're doing any conversion of ASCII to hex or to octal, we would like to view the hex contents or the hex dumps of the file, be it ASCII or binary. Let us see in this article how to do that. And they started with a simple file 1, which only contains a welcome string. Just welcome. And then they describe how to use hexdump and other utilities like OD.
Yeah, so they just run hexdump on the file, and you see the first column is actually the offset in the file. So all zeros first, and then a bunch of strings. And the next line starts with an 8, meaning that's 8 bytes into the file, and that's the end of the file in that case. But whereas if you do hexdump-C, you can see it actually prints it out as individual bytes. A little easier to see the hex. And then on the far right side, you see the actual ASCII. So you can see, that 77 corresponds to W, and 6C corresponds to the L. And then the last character is actually 0A, which is the new line character.
Yeah, that also needs to be there.
And then you can see how, again, you can do OD-X, gives you the same output as hexdump, basically. And then if you add the -C, then it can print the individual characters as well.
Oh, yep. Very cool.
Yep. And then XXD is somewhat similar to hexdump-C, but slightly different without the pipe delimiters and so on, and so on.
These are good to have in your Unix toolbox in case you need to do some hexing.
They also show here, if you take output of XXD and put it in a file, if you do XXD-R, it will reverse the hex content and give you back the ASCII.
Good to compare that the input is actually also reversible into the output.
Right. Or, if you get the hex for something, you can always figure out what it means.
It's time for feedback and questions, as always. And definitely send us feedback and questions every week, or, at least often enough so that we can fill this segment or this part of the show. Sebastian did this with a ZFS setup question toward ESX. So we start with him. And his message goes, "Hi, Alan and Benedict. I'm a first-timer writer. That's okay. But long-time watcher and Patreon contributor. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for a great show and for the boost that you've been to my career." Oh, wow. We weren't aware of that. But yeah, here we go. I was watching my Why We Still Love ZFS Part 2 in this Monday's this Monday. And Alan, you piqued my interest when you mentioned the use of ZFS with ESXi, which brings me to my question. A while back, I built a 4U Xeon E5-2620 FreeNAS with 64 gigs of ECC memory. I also recently received an HP ProLine G7 DL360 from my employer and have just installed VMware ESXi 6.7 on it. My initial thought was that I would create an iSCSI share with a Z-Vault from one of my pools, However, if I understood you correctly, there's a plugin for ESXi that would be able to manage this for me in a seamless manner. Would you care to elaborate on this and maybe share a few pointers on how to best proceed with that setup?
So it depends. Like, there's not really a dedicated plugin or something, but you have a couple of options. One option is to have a separate zvol for each VM, which would be, a matter of every time you want to make a new VM, you have to create the iSCSI thing in FreeNAS and then hook it up to ESX and so on. The other option is to create one large zvol and have VMware format it with its VMFS or whatever. And that way you can keep adding and removing VMs from it, and it's all kind of managed by VMware. You do still have to, you have to create the zvol on the FreeNAS side still. It's just a matter of, do you want to do it once and just give all the space to VMware and it can use it how it likes? Or do you want to actually create a separate iSCSI for each different VM?
Yeah.
The advantage to the one bigger zvol is obviously the kind of unused space from a bunch of VMs is available to yet another VM.
You can never have enough, yeah. And once the setup is in place, I guess you will spin up a lot more VMs because, I could do this, or I could try this out in a different VM. So he writes that he doesn't have any dedicated fiber channel, but have set up a separate VLAN for iSCSI and have 2 dedicated NICs for this in both the FreeNAS and the ESXi server.
Right. So depending on your speed, you can get even, you could use 10 gigabit NICs and stuff. Fiber channel is definitely not a requirement.
Yeah, it's easy to get started with just the basic, what the NIC gives you.
Yeah, and a couple of NICs is probably going to be fast enough for what you're doing anyway. Would
you recommend some kind of lag setup for this?
Yeah, if you're going to use multiple NICs, you probably want to do that. You do have to make sure that, it depends on your setup. Like if a switch is involved, you have to make sure the switch isn't going to be silly about it. Some cheaper switches only do lags based on MAC addresses. And so obviously your FreeNAS has one MAC address and your ESX has one. And so all the traffic is going to go over one side. Whereas if you can configure all the components to hash based on the TCP port number, that way, basically, you're hashing usually either layer 2, which is MAC addresses, layer 3, which is IP addresses, or layer 4, which is port number, and usually includes the lower ones too. So if you can get it to do on the combination of IP address and port number, it means that if you actually have 2 different connections, they'll actually load balance nicely.
Yeah.
But that might actually involve you would need 2 different zvols or 2 different iSCSI sessions in order to actually take advantage of more than one link.
Oh, yes. Yeah. But yeah, definitely something to start with. And it shouldn't be too difficult, especially since FreeNAS helps you a lot with that graphical interface.
Yes. Dave in the chat room points out FreeNAS does have support for VAI, which is this kind of API for VMware to talk to the storage. But I think that's more about having it do server-side copying and cloning and stuff. So if you want to duplicate a VM or something, it can do it on the server side instead of having to copy it all across the network and then all back across the network. You can just say, hey, on the server side, copy these blocks to those blocks or zero this range of blocks and so on. But it should just work. Let us know how it goes and if you get stuck.
Yeah, send us a follow-up question. Then you're not the first-time submitter anymore. Which is fine. I mean, if it's just a question and that solves all your issues, then perfectly reasonable to not send us more until the next problem occurs. Christopher is next with questions, so multiple ones. Writing, hi Alan and Benedict. First of all, thanks for the show. Thank you. I especially enjoyed higher audio quality on the road since episode 301. See, someone got better audio experience from that.
Yes. Extra thanks to Joe and Drew for the editing.
Yeah, they're doing a great job. And for us, it's a little bit, it's not too difficult to do that. Especially because I've never really watched the videos on YouTube. Okay, so audio only, that's fine. Since you've asked, I have a question for you. Sorry that it's a ZFS question. We're totally fine with the occasional ZFS question here and there, which seems to be a pattern in the show. Yeah, it's almost ZFS now. Okay, so is there a way to get a mail notification if something happens to the zpool? I have used ZFS Event Daemon, ZED, on CentOS previously, but I'm unable to find anything similar on FreeBSD. At the moment, I'm using SmartD to get a notification on a drive failure, but a pool could be degraded for reasons not catched by that. He has also found devd/zfs.conf, but it seems he's unable to configure it properly and can't find a list of potential events to listen for. Do we have any hints here?
Yeah, okay. For the mail notifications, the zpool status check is done daily as part of the daily run report that FreeBSD does. So if you configure root's email to go to you, you should get that. Yeah, so something like Zed or ZED is ZFSD on FreeBSD, which takes care of automatically enabling spares and so on, but it doesn't really do email. The devd ZFS stuff is probably the right place to look. So devd gets a notification from ZFS every time there's an event that's basically using the same mechanism that ZED does on CentOS. The list of events is defined in the ZFS source code somewhere. That's really something that probably should have a man page. That's an interesting idea. Good project for someone who's just getting started and would like to help out with ZFS is basically there's a .h file with a list of all the event types and a little bit about them, and you could learn a little bit more about them and then just write some documentation on the ZFS wiki or write the man page if you're adventurous, and we can get that included as part of this OpenZFS project. So those could definitely be made to email you. But yeah, something like the ZFS event daemon that could do a little bit more and take care of notification type stuff would be kind of interesting.
Some monitoring systems have some kind of zpool monitoring in there, but if you really want to know this disappeared or the actual status of the pool.
Right, like we have checks at Scale Engine that tell us, if the zpool status is anything other than online and so on. That's basically just running zpool list-o status or something like that, or name comma status. And it gives us a list of every pool and what its status is. And it's easy to parse, go from there. So yeah, for email, if you enable the default FreeBSD daily mails, that'll help, although you'd actually have to look at them. It's not really a notification per se. There are lots of different ways to do it, but there's not a standard way, and maybe there should be.
Or maybe someone has written something customized.
I'm sure lots of people have things for this. Yeah, I know like my friend Mikey literally does zpool status to a file and MD5s it, and if it's not the same as it was when he set up the script, it sends an alert, so it finds any change, because he doesn't want to know just if the pool is degraded. He wants to know if any of the error counters go up or if anything changes at all.
So if he does a scrub monthly, wouldn't the different timestamp trigger an alarm?
Well, I think he compares it to what it was yesterday, so he only sends an email each time it changes.
Yeah, because otherwise every month you get the notification that something has changed and it was just a scrub. Yeah, so if someone has something, send this to us or send us a note to feedback@bsdnow.tv so we can include it in a future episode. Thanks for that question. Funzi, I guess that's the German pronunciation.
Yeah, sorry we didn't have a better answer for you. We really should.
Last but not least is Sarah, I guess, with Beehive and Microsoft SQL question. Oh, that's an interesting combination. Writing, hi all. I'm new to FreeBSD and I wanted to explore the possibility of virtualizing an old machine running Windows Server 2008 with Windows SQL. I haven't found much information describing possible problems, if there are any, and the only relevant posts I found here were in the FreeNAS forum, so he links to two about Beehive Windows SQL Server and setting the disk sector size. Should I avoid using Beehive in this case? Are there any workarounds in the cases described? Would really appreciate your comments. So I'm actually not aware of any problems, but I haven't digged into it too deep or have run it in that specific combination, Windows Server and Windows SQL, because I stay away from that stuff as much as possible. But there's a need for people. Definitely, it should be something that is possible.
The problem here was that by default, Beehive passed through the block size of the virtual device that you backed the VM with. And all supported versions of Beehive now have an option when you create a virtual disk to let you specify the sector size. Because I know older versions of Windows SQL Server didn't like having large sectors.
Yes, yeah.
They want small ones.
They're kind of picky about that.
Just setting it as part of the Beehive invocation is the solution now. It's a problem that's been solved for a while now.
Oh, okay. So that's good to hear.
If you're using the FreeNAS GUI to do it, it's a little different. But If you're just doing it manually on FreeBSD, then yeah, just when you're defining the disk, as you can see in the Beehive man page, when you're setting the disk, you have the extra parameter.
One of the many now.
You see, it says block device options, and you can do sector size equals logical/physical. You can even emulate disks that lie, that are actually 4K but pretend to be 512 byte. You can actually do that by doing sector size equals 512/4096. And so, yeah, that's been a built-in feature in Beehive for a while now and should be available in all supported versions of FreeBSD as of today.
I guess this will also make its way into the FreeNAS GUI at one point, so you can just activate it there.
Yeah, I've not done it there, so I don't know exactly how to do it, but I'm sure that it's a common enough thing that they've taken care of that.
Okay. Great to see that things are already fixed. So get the references there in the man page from Beehive, and then you should be on your way. Thanks for sending that question, and that pretty much wraps up this week's episode of BSD Now. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.